Hello, I'm Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin. I am with the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance and also part of a small ecosystem of organizations and partners, including the Tree Range Operation, which is a chicken brand that we are deploying with partners in the Southeast Minnesota region, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and also my own farm, Salvatierra Farm, which is now based out of Northfield, Minnesota. I'm here today to talk to you about a very important topic. Is the aspect of regenerative agriculture as an indigenous way of thinking. Is a In where I come from, the fundamental issue that we are facing today is the fact that we have colonized ourselves to the point that we have become mentally colonized. And in order to actually return the nature to its original, return ourselves to a way that we can operate again as part of nature rather than from outside of nature, we must start a process of mental detox of sorts, which I'm just calling for practical purposes, decolonizing of the mind. So with that in mind, and thinking about indigenous ways or indigenizing our ways as a concept, I'll walk you through a series of exercises and examples on how we, not only at the RAA, at the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, but also within a much larger ecosystem across the Midwest, we are seeking to not only reinvent ourselves, but reconnect ourselves and also indigenize ourselves as we go forward and lead the movement to build a regenerative agriculture future. First of all, let's get some concepts out of the way. The first part of it, the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance. At the Alliance, we are an ecosystem of individuals, organizations dedicated to building system-level infrastructure that can deliver socially just, economically balanced, and ecologically resilient, as well as spiritually grounded regenerative agriculture system outcomes. And important to point out that regenerative agriculture, really looked at from an indigenous perspective, starts by understanding our spiritual connection to creation, to food, to the land, and to each other. And from that emanates our commitment to ecological, economic, and social outcomes, not the other way around. So critical, regenerative agriculture starts with our reconnection to the foundation of the concept, which is spiritual. The shared mission of the Alliance is really to focus on assisting and scaling up the regenerative agriculture supply chain with a focus on regenerative poultry as an entry point and as an area of concentration for the foreseeable future. Our shared vision is that we collectively, with other organizations and within the poultry sector, make regenerative agriculture the norm going forward. Our strategy is centered not too much on putting the Alliance, the RAA, as the center of things, but rather the ecosystem we are part of. So basically, the growth of our organization is not the objective. Perpetuating our organization is not the objective. Building a career as employees of the organization, that's not the objective. The objective and the strategy is to build an organization within a larger ecosystem in a way that is indigenous, meaning just the same way we are indigenous to creation and we are part of it, rather than talking about nature as something that we go into or that we work with or that we manage, we as the indigenous perspective places us within it rather than outside of it. In the same way, at the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, we seek to manage our relationship with all of the other organisms within this regenerative agriculture ecosystem from within, rather than seeing the ecosystem as something that we go into, similar to the both concepts, right? So that's really critical in terms of setting up strategy, because as we go forward, our objective is to support existing regenerative agriculture supply chain infrastructure and also system level projects, as long as they contribute tangible benefits to the collective nature of regenerative agriculture outcomes, and to focus on ecosystem management and system level ownership, control, and governance as the core foundation of structural systems change. Systems change being the key word here. We are here to change a system, not to build an organization. And we can only do that collectively. There's no other way that a system actually changes in the way this system of agriculture needs to for us to have a regenerative outcome. And then here are some startup concepts that we must understand before going forward. The first thing is, if we're going to talk about decolonization, we need to define it, or at least create a framework for understanding it. And in short, decolonization really is a process that results in the transformation of ownership, control, and governing structures that currently, in the colonized world, perpetrate extraction, appropriation, destruction, expropriation, and extermination of indigenous-centered cultures and life on Earth, while validating such actions in the name of progress. That's how we got here. That's what colonizing systems do. And decolonization results only when we can revert that or transform it and transition and build a new reality where those things are balanced out with our need to restore, to stop extraction, to stop destroying, to stop expropriating, and result in more embracing of indigenous ways of thinking and working with the resources that were given to us through creation. The indigenization is more of a process of self-reflection, includes the individual, but also conscientization that results in seeing, comprehending, studying, interacting, and working with the natural systems and with each other based on an identity that reflects our dependency on living systems. It is a process by which we take our own responsibility to preserve, respect, and protect the evolutionary processes that generated the conditions that allowed for life to emerge and that will ensure the preservation of the diversity of life on the planet. And that, by the way, includes us, because we are part of that living system, those organisms. That being able to identify with that and understand that we are born of the earth and we will go back to the earth. We are made of the same elements, that we belong there, that's who we are. Our basic human identity as an organism of the earth is precisely there. When we understand that, and when we act upon it, and when we go about everyday things that we do with a full understanding of that, then we can call ourselves indigenous. Now, let's separate this from being a native of a certain specific space. So native communities, we are very clear that they are identified by territories that they have occupied. They may have been invaded and displaced from their territories, but there is an identity associated with a geographical location where they came from. Now, as humanity, we could and we can become indigenous to the earth, and we can act upon that, no matter whether we are Black, Latino, Anglo, or native of the North American continent. So separating those two things is critical. It just also happens that most of the native communities in the world today are the ones who have continued to understand and to practice their indigenous nature. Most have chosen to bend over and to let the colonizing nature we are also born with dominate their ways of living and being. And that's the big difference between a colonizing culture and an indigenous culture, which the colonizing culture builds infrastructure and governance according to that colonizing instinct we're working with and tends to dominate the world, and actually has dominated the world at this point as we continue to elect and to select and to empower the very small percentage of the population that is born with a dominant colonizing gene or impetus or gift or whatever it is, while the indigenous governing system sought to balance out the indigenous nature we're working with, or we're born with the colonizing nature we're born with. And so those governing systems, if we study the ancient organizing systems, sought to balance those two forces so that those folks who are naturally born to do more of that aggressive takeover and are born with that talent, were given a purpose within the larger context of the society so that they didn't become the dominant force and then, went about destroying the world the way we have done by encouraging and empowering the smaller portion of the populations of the world who are now sitting on the tops of corporations, in the top of governing institutions and all that, for the most part, and dominate the rules by which we govern everything we do. So those are very important concepts. We must understand them appropriately if we're going to talk about how we can then move into the context of decolonization and re-indigenization. One easy way to identify how colonizing cultures work is to look at outcomes. For example, we accept the perpetuation of extractive and exploitative practices. For the most part, you see only native communities resisting, say pipelines and other kinds of projects that are extremely dangerous and extractive. Everybody else seems to be on a different platform, and that's the result of most of us accepting colonizing ways. Community and social, economic, and independence is compromised, and that's critical. Colonizing forces and colonizing systems need the communities to be divided. They need people to look at themselves as individuals, because without those characteristics, it's impossible to take over the resources of a place. This is the fundamental reason indigenous communities or native communities who are practicing indigenous ways across the world has been seen as the enemy of the current systems all over the place, because they seek to work collectively for the well-being of everybody, and they see the well-being of everybody and the health of everybody as the foundation of the individual health, rather than the opposite, which is never true. We can't build a healthy society on the basis of focusing on individuals. Individual priorities have to be there to a certain extent, but again, balanced with the collective interest of a healthy society. And that disrupting that is central to colonization strategies. We have legitimized and legalized violence against anything that is counter to the system, such as ancestral traditions and knowledge, culture, food sovereignty, all of those things that represent more of our indigenous heritage and our indigenous identity has been legitimized, whether by naming it counter to development, counter to well-being, counter to job creation, all kinds of things like that, or labeling it communism when it's really just Guatemalan communities trying to continue to live as indigenous peoples. All of that has been done in the name of, for the purpose of colonization. The legalization and abuse of government-sponsored corporate takeovers and market manipulation. All of the systems we have created follow that very traditional, very straightforward, actual, line by line colonizing structures. We have concentrated ownership and control of whole systems on individuals and the corporations that they manage, or the corporations that represent the interests of a few individuals. Either way, same result. Whole systems should never be given that sort of consolidated power. Systematizing repression of indigenous knowledge and science is central. And you will find that evidence of that everywhere, where if you say, for example, sitting in the forest and spending an hour meditating and observing and in silence actually is very important for our brain waves and for our mental health, immediately somebody's going to say, well, if he's saying that, does he have scientific proof of it? And the question is always, isn't the very scientific community that we now require to have proof from for these kinds of concepts, isn't that the very scientific community that invalidated everything that was working just fine before we have the current scientific community? And also at the same time, they were the ones that validated the very things, the very foundation on which we are destroying the world and our very ability to be healthy to begin with. Now, do we want them validating these things? No. They simply work, and they are validated, by the way, thoroughly, by geoevolutionary processes to which we are part of, and we are part of the trees. The trees evolve with us. We are in sync with them. Whether it's validated by the current scientific community or not is irrelevant. It's not up to them to validate that. It's simply the way things are. So think of that for a second, and how we have systemically built infrastructure to repress that indigenous knowledge and science. That's part of an outcome of colonizing cultures. The result is really the uprooting of spirituality, the grounding traditions, the individual raising to the bottom, the consumerism, the climate disruption, the ecological collapse, war, conflict, disease, social breakdown. All of those things are indicators that we must see and interpret in the proper framework of the very culture of colonization we have built. Now, key outcomes of a decolonized culture. Now let's look at the reverse of that. So one of the things we got to look at, when we decolonize, we ensure that natural resources are managed in perpetuity. They are not extracted exclusively for short-term gains, so that they can regenerate and continue evolving as nature intended. We see social and economic interdependence as central to ensuring well-being. We see ancestral traditions, knowledge, wisdom validated and adapted to ensure collective mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. Those are results of decolonizing. If you are working on decolonization and those are not the outcomes that you are generating, then let's reevaluate the process, let's fine-tune it, let's relearn, and let's re-engage. We're not going to get it right the first time or the second. The colonizing system didn't get it right the first and second and third and many hundreds of times. By the time the colonizers came to the North American continent, for example, they had, I believe, over 3,000 years of perfecting war machines, weaponry, and all of that. So the beautiful thing is that what we have, the indigenous ways, the decolonized way, has hundreds of thousands of years of history. It was well perfected. It was just not violent, and that's why it has been taken over. Whole systems are collectively controlled and governed even when private ownership of assets, like property, plant, and equipment, are part of the collective. But the whole systems are controlled and governed by the collective, which is central to balancing out, again, the impetus of some to take over with the need of others to be more holistically part of an ecosystem. Basically, we have, in average, I figure about 10% of any group that it wants to take over. But just like warriors and other folks, like volunteers who just want to go to the army and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that unless it takes over the whole society. And so, but most of us just, artists, creative people, farmers, there is 90% of us just want to have a place to be ourselves and to thrive as humans. So defending, protecting, enhancing the collective interest is systemically structured within the governance and system level surveillance. So if you look at the governance structure of Native Indigenous communities, they had a lot of women participation. In some of them, the women were the first that would evaluate the situation that needed to be dealt with. And then there were layers of screening, so to speak, to make sure that the solutions were holistic. So that system is what the Native communities were defending when colonizers came into this part of the world. And we need to restore those defensive mechanisms so we can enhance this collective interest that we have for well-being. The end result is really that spirituality and traditions are uplifted as a result of what we do. Collective assets management rises quality of life. It's just like forest management. Some of the collective forests that is still managed as commons in many Native communities around the world. Guatemala, Mexico, Los Ejidos, and the forest in Guatemala, all of those are raising the quality of life of those communities through collective management. Basic needs are met, food, shelter, and basic things that we all need. The environment is protected locally and globally. Nothing stays in the house as far as, global climate is concern. Everything we emit goes around the globe. So by acting this way, we are protecting our local environment, but also the global environment. Resilience is a central goal rather than just sustainability or just keeping what we have. Conflict is managed rather than repressed and then allowed to blow up and become violent. Social rules center on accountability and interdependence. Health focuses on well-being rather than the management of disease. Very fundamental outcomes that are good for all of us as we decolonize our communities and our ways of thinking. And, just to insert that last piece, governance, the supply and demand and value chains reflect real community needs and priorities, resilience and collective wealth creation, rather than governance reflecting the interest of a few over the well-being of many. So, understanding the colonization process, let's just go quickly through this. The idea of discovery, new land, new ideas, new people, new concepts, new stories. The naming of the discovery, Americas, Indies, the regenerative is another area of discovery for a lot of people today, even though it's an ancient way of doing things in indigenous communities. The legal appropriation and expropriation of those, whether it's lands or intellectual property, land grabs, trade rules, copyright, trademark, branding, patents on life. If those are not done in a decolonized structure, then it becomes part again of the decolonizing process. The standardization and scalability of repression, of ownership and control at such a level that single companies now are, have equivalent revenues of multiple countries in some cases, annual GDP. The building of the systems to repress indigenous thinking and attempts at re-indigenizing ways of living and intellect, those are all parts of colonizing structures that we must understand if we're going to understand the solutions to such large-scale structured in systems. Understanding decolonization, the first thing we have to understand is that reversals have to go also as methodical and systemic as the colonization process itself, with the difference that we are holistic and fully inclusive. So rediscovering Aboriginal systems, those ideas, bringing them back, concepts, bringing them back, the storytelling, all of that, put it back into the current context of the world we live in, renaming and reclaiming and securing those ideas, concepts, stories, lands, lakes, rivers, rituals, traditions. There's so much to be put back into that commons space. The rebuilding of community governance and protection systems. We have perfectly good blueprints on how holistic government, how to re-indigenize, how we think about governance, about sector-specific, community-validated and backed governing councils. We have so many of those structures still alive today in so many places, and it's just a matter of expanding them and rebuilding that. Standardizing processes to reclaim and return Aboriginal systems to their original purpose. The purpose of holistically supporting thinking and appreciating and enjoying life. It was never about extracting wealth or anything like that. The processes, these processes under a decolonization process do seek the well-being of everyone, but it is through that holistic thinking, appreciating and enjoying of life. And then, of course, expand and organize new system to scale up organizing locally, regionally, and nationally, aggregating representation from localized governing councils to centralized governing councils that represent multi-layers. And to exemplify that, let me show you this little diagram here. In other words, this is the organizational diagram of a decolonized, say, nonprofit or business or whatever we want to look at. And this could be put in contrast with a hierarchical, rectangular, chief executive officer, program or BPs, program managers, staffing, and all of that. That is the expression of a colonizing system. This is the expression of a decolonized governing structure. On the outer circles, we could have the smaller units that is still big enough to create self-governance. For example, a region of poultry producers could be one of those circles. But also another circle will be within that same region of poultry producers, those producers who say are Hmong. So they create their own circle to be able to represent those interests, objectives, and goals that are particular to their community because of their background. There could be another one of those circles of Latin American immigrant farmers, another circle that would be just all of the farmers together as poultry producers. Different representations as long as they fulfill a specific goal and specific commonalities that can be articulated in the form of objectives that are particular and apply only to that specific cluster that was formed. Those are governing councils. That's the way we can start rebuilding these ancient ways of governing. And then out of that, we can select governance representatives that actually live every day and make a living off of what the group that they are part of. So if I'm part of the poultry producers group, I'm invested in ensuring that the next layer of governance represents those interests because that's my livelihood. So it's not some volunteer job I go out there to do because somebody picked me, and I do it because of the goodwill and because of altruistic reasons. I do that too. That has to be part of the equation, but not all of it. Part of it has to come back to me so I can feed my family and I can have food security and all of those things. So as a poultry producer, I want to be part of that governing council at the next layer, where I may share that governing responsibility with folks coming out of the pork clusters, multiple layers in the pork clusters, and so on. That layer then of governance creates another layer of governance till we get to the center of that diagram where we have the actual governing council. That governing council is accountable all the way back to the outer circles. And then it goes back and forth, across, up, down, backwards, whichever way you want to go. It's an ecosystem rather than an organizational structure. That is the difference between indigenous thinking and colonizing thinking. So we have to understand that this is a countercultural request, ask from you, from everyone, is radical. It is the result of organizing collective governance and equity and inclusivity, things that we are now talking at a large scale, but not necessarily ready to understand what it actually means. Well, this is a representation, a diagram that represents in a picture what all of those things may look like. So remember, it's not about narrative. It's about what we do. And in this case, we must apply the 90-10 rule. Narrative, 10%, 90% is what we do. So the narrative here is very short. What we need to do and the reports of progress towards this should fill, if we got a 10-page report at the end of this year, one of them should be narrative. The other 9 pages should be progress reports. Progress reports as to how many councils were created, how many people are participating, how many sectors were engaged, how much percentage of the whole ecosystem is now engaged in collective governance. That should fill 9 pages, progress report, and only 1 page of narrative of what we are doing. So just to keep that in mind as we go forward, that will get us unstuck from this spinning wheel that generated the current racial and inequality, the economic injustice, and the discrimination that we are suffering from at this very moment in our history in this country. We got to understand that as a part of being that subversive force, this concept of indigenization is radical. It departs from a nature-based foundation, is from below, is rooted on the ground. It's not rooted on some market forces that we have created artificially. It's grounded on actually how things work, rather than what we want to bend the world to be for our individual benefit. So it's radical, it's subversive. That's why I always talk about not building a ecosystem, but rather an insurgency. Why? An intellectual insurgency, because it's by building systems with integrity and commitment, which is central to being an insurgent in any kind of setting. is critical for us to be able to achieve these outcomes with integrity. And what it means also is that we can revolutionize with this way of thinking. We can really ignite engagement at a larger scale because everything is connected. So I may be a regenerative poultry producer, but I depend on grain producers, on farmers who are growing annual crops so that the manure from my operation can be used. So biophysical and chemical processes can be engaged holistically so that the inputs for one farm are the outputs of another farm, and so on and so forth, in a system where we are actually not producers of anything, but rather stewards of energy transformation. Energy that a farm may have in excess, like poultry manure, can be used by a farmer who has vegetable production, who's going to have an energy deficiency because of the energy that is being taken out by those annual crops, and so on. That's an indigenous way of designing, and it's a revolutionary way of thinking, and it can ignite changes and engagement at a scale that we still have to see in this country. Not only on the farming and production or energy transformation cycles, but also how we organize the enterprises. So this is the expression of a evolutionary process where those forms of working with the land gives us the blueprint for how to impact and adapt and be agile, resilient, and nature-driven, and innovate from a nature-driven design so that we can build enterprises that are symbiotically connected the same way that energy flows through a farm to generate harvestable energy in the form of, say, eggs or hazelnuts or any of those expressions of energy, so we can use the same blueprint to organize the next layer, which is how we interconnect farmers and their enterprises to create a larger scale system without compromising the fundamentals of biophysical and chemical processes that we inherited from the geoevolutionary process of the earth, and without compromising the fact that some farmers may want to work alone, some farmers may want to be small, some may want to be a little bit larger, and also especially not building structural barriers by the way we design this, so that smaller farmers, especially those coming from immigrant communities, can't enter the system because they don't have land, or because they don't have other resources or the knowledge or the language skills or any of those elements. That's what makes the system evolutionary, but also decolonize from a thought process perspective, which is the concept of decolonizing the mind. We do this and we arrive at that uncompromising destination we keep trying to tag our targets onto. It's called regenerative systems. And in agriculture, regenerative systems simply are those that seek not to produce, but to manage and to steward process of energy transformation. It's those systems where financiers don't seek to extract profits from those who borrow their money, but become partners in a process of enhancing wealth and creating more wealth and enjoying it collectively. And of course, their income is also important. It's in this space where scientists don't come to invalidate what we know already works, but rather seek to use the knowledge they have to combine it with the ancient indigenous wisdom, so that collectively, between the indigenous wisdom and the bit of knowledge that we have, we can actually achieve regenerative outcomes. A little bit of knowledge with a lot of wisdom goes a very long ways. A lot of knowledge with no wisdom is exactly the recipe for colonizing the earth and destroying the planet and our own ability to live on it. It's a space where those folks in nonprofits and in other kinds of ecosystems don't come here trying to save, workers from mistreatment in the plants, or save indigenous communities from themselves, as a lot of white saviors are going about their days these days. But it is in a space where those folks consider themselves immigrants. Those folks come and immigrate into this ancient regenerative way of thinking that is indigenous, that was preserved by native communities over thousands and thousands of years. So folks coming into this regenerative space right now need to think of themselves as immigrants into the regenerative space, just the same way, if we could reverse time, Christopher Columbus could have been an immigrant into this wealth of knowledge, wisdom, and capacity in this new land. And we could have a different outcome as a result of that. Instead, they chose to colonize, destroy, maim, and give us what we have today. Instead of that, we could now choose to migrate into the regenerative space. Instead of again going in, discovering it, naming it, appropriating it, expropriating it, colonizing it, and turning it back to where we don't want to go. So that is the essence of decolonizing of the mind. Now, you may agree or you may disagree. You may want to invalidate this kind of thought process or validate it. It's up to you. I can't do anything about it. I am only responsible for my choices on this earth. You are responsible for your own choices. I choose ancient. I choose to be indigenous to the earth. I choose to be part of it, not to manage it. I choose to be part of a process that is endless, a process that guarantees the perpetuation of life in balance for as long as we, as the earth, can be. So, with that, I hope you have enough material now to have a robust conversation and to start your own journey into this new and brighter future that we can collectively build and enjoy. Thank you.